Let me tell you, we want change and we advocate for change.
That's Mary Balakun-Gary. She's a feminist activist and the founder of the Rwandan Women's Network. It's work she's been doing for over 30 years.
We began by integrating orphanages and encouraging women, especially widows, whose families were almost wiped out. We took up also a program that was to look into counseling, into economic empowerment, and also looking at the whole reconciliation program that had just been designed by the government.
Mary was born in Rwanda, but her family fled the country when she was just 6 years old. She didn't return to Rwanda until 1995, the year after genocide in her home country killed more than 10% of the population.
Over the course of just 100 days, about 800,000 people were slaughtered in Rwanda by ethnic Hutu extremists.
With the genocide only ending after a Tutsi rebel group fought and took control of the country, prompting more than 2 million Hutus to flee to the eastern DRC.
This year marks the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. But what a lot of people might not realize is that tensions in this part of the world, they've never really ended. And in recent years, the conflict has heated back up.
The M23 rebels say they are fighting to protect their Tutsi community in eastern DRC from rival militia groups like the FDLR, composed of ethnic Hutus.
With UN experts saying that they have strong evidence that Rwanda's army was fighting alongside the rebel group. Kigali has repeatedly rejected these accusations and instead accused Congo's army of shelling villages in Rwandan territory along the border.
The UN has warned that the recent surge in violence risks a regional conflict.
There are men carrying guns now everywhere.
Thousands of civilians have been killed in the crossfire, with hundreds of thousands fleeing into neighboring Uganda.
The UN peacekeeping force that's currently in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, just west of Mary's home country, it's unpopular.
To be very honest, the peacekeepers in DRC, I don't know what they're doing.
And it's scheduled to withdraw from the region by the end of the year.
Nobody seems to be really taking this crisis seriously.
Mary sees echoes of the Rwandan genocide in these current conflicts. She and her colleagues are using their knowledge and experience of what happened before to try to help prevent it from happening again.
We have now connected with the women of the region into a network where we're actually learning from each other. And in our dialogues, we ask them to also tell us the socioeconomic political context of their own countries so that we can be able to help them on how to situate that kind of approach of safe spaces in their own context. And that in itself helped us to learn a lot beyond just empowering ourselves as women. We are also able to learn and understand the political dynamics in our neighboring countries. So for us, that's a lot of power for women.
The fact that feminist women like Mary are leading initiatives and empowering other women to become important policymakers in their own political systems is a hopeful story for feminism and foreign policy. But sometimes, as we know, conflict still escalates.
Yet another large boom. Cruise and ballistic missiles are being fired at Kyiv.
There was another deadly airstrike just last night. The UN says around 450,000 people have now been displaced in southern Gaza.
And as the world watches Rafah and the International Criminal Court considers whether Israel's actions in Gaza constitute genocide, maybe it's time to re-examine how the world should respond to atrocities. The international community was slow to intervene to stop the genocide in Rwanda in 1994.
The UN was heavily criticised in the wake of the massacre for not intervening.
It was a failure that has defined the UN ever since.
But any decision for a foreign country or international body like the UN to intervene physically in another country, it's complicated by a slew of moral, legal, economic, and political factors, which is part of why our current system seems to produce a lot of failed interventions.
The tumultuous end to America's longest war, the Taliban's lightning-fast takeover of Afghanistan just weeks before the United States' planned military withdrawal triggered such intense panic that thousands of Afghans stormed the Kabul airport in a desperate attempt to flee the country.
All too often, when we try to solve the problem by sending soldiers, people get hurt. And many times they're the very same people we promised to protect. When it comes to fighting injustice, the international system, it's kind of broken. But maybe feminist foreign policy will have some ideas about how to fix it. I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom.
Hi, it's Maria Hinojosa. This week we're covering the historic elections in Mexico because a woman is going to be elected president for the first time in the country's history.
Mexico is having an historical process. For me, it's hopeful that a lot of women that are really capable are taking a part in politics.
And we'll be talking to the two top candidates themselves, Claudia Sheinbaum, the predicted winner, and her opponent, Xochitl Gálvez. All this coming up on this week's Latino USA.
The problem is the unwillingness to actually then think through, okay, now that we have feminist foreign policy and we've had the opportunity to rethink the different things that we do in our international relations, how do we then go about it in practice?
This is Dr. Toni Hastrup.
I'm a researcher and a teacher at the University of Manchester in the UK, where I'm also a full professor and chair in global politics.
She's an expert in global power structures and the ways that those hierarchies shape the international political system itself. And a dozen years after the Arab Spring, she sees some important lessons about where intervention went wrong in Libya.
After days of discussion, agreement is reached for NATO to assume command of the no-fly zone over Libya.
It's an astonishing scene. Muammar Gaddafi battered and bloody, and today he died at the hands of his own people, aided by a 7-month bombing campaign led by Britain and France and the United States.
Muammar Gaddafi was an authoritarian leader who had been leader for a very long time.
Gaddafi was the leader of Libya for 42 years. But during the Arab Spring in 2011, he was deposed and brutally killed.
I think what was really interesting about this time is that for a very long time, Muammar Gaddafi had been kind of ostracized by the international community because of his role or perceived role in the Lockerbie bombing many years ago.
A Pan Am 747 jumbo jet with 255 people on board has crashed just north of the Scottish border.
The Lockerbie bombing was a terrorist attack on a passenger jet flying over Scotland. The bomb was allegedly planted by Libyan intelligence officers.
Muammar Gaddafi insisted that he did not order this bombing. However, he refused to turn over the two suspects.
But in the couple of years leading up to 2011, it seemed as if he'd been accepted back into the fold, as it were.
For many years, Gaddafi was known, especially in the West, as a dangerous dictator who was often in conflict with the U.S. and its allies.
By the same token, someone else will tell you that, Libya under Muammar Gaddafi had a 94% literacy rate, which is higher than a lot of countries.
That's not to say he wasn't problematic.
Someone who's authoritarian and who commits atrocities, very problematic.
But like Toni said, Gaddafi was more or less back in good graces internationally before his demise. He attended high-level meetings and conferences in NATO countries. President Obama shook his hand at the G8 summit. His spot as the indefinite ruler of Libya, it looked pretty secure. That is until the Arab Spring protests came to Libya.
In 2011, mass uprisings set much of the Arab world alight.
We want a free election.
And his response to those protests was very brutal. And we did see atrocities happening.
Gaddafi's forces killed hundreds of civilian protesters, and the conflict spiraled into a civil war that included systematic starvation by pro-Gaddafi forces, attacks on hospitals and mosques, and civilians murdered by factions on all sides.
But when they started happening, there wasn't an immediate idea that, okay, this is happening now, tomorrow we're going to invoke R2P.
R2P stands for Responsibility to Protect. It's a global political commitment endorsed by the UN in 2005, largely as a response to the international community's failure to prevent atrocities in Rwanda, Somalia, and the former Yugoslavia. The idea is that every country has a duty to protect the people in its borders from atrocities like war crimes and genocide. And if a country doesn't do that, the rest of the world has a duty to step up. But decisions about when to intervene are never, ever clean-cut.
A lot of people might claim that a successful case of R2P intervention was Libya, where NATO did what it was supposed to do, which, of course, a lot of people called for, including some Libyans themselves, including some Libyan feminists,
But another international body, the African Union, was opposed to the military intervention in Libya from the start.
Because it had other implications. For example, those events have had a direct link to insecurity in the Sahel, which has put even more women at risk, which has put gender equality even more at risk, and certainly democratic governance. There was a sense that that intervention led by NATO forces helped to prevent a potential massacre in places like Benghazi, and it certainly, without a doubt, contributed to the fall of Gaddafi's regime. But he was killed in a very brutal way, and there has been a lot of contestation about how he was killed, because if you were really doing this in accordance with the laws of war, then he should have been brought to justice.
Instead, rebel forces found Gaddafi hiding in a drainage pipe in his hometown, and they killed him.
The other part is, okay, so all of that happens. Are civilians really protected? What becomes of Libyans in the aftermath of 2011? And I think you just have to look at the current context to really judge what impact a sort of so-called success story of RTP actually had. In the context of Libya, I think the aftermath really speaks for itself.
By 2014, Libya spiraled into a second civil war, one that consumed the country for 6 years. Today, Libya still ranks among the least free countries in the world, according to Freedom House. And Human Rights Watch reports that human rights violations and abuses are pervasive in the country.
R2P has always been problematic, and it will probably challenge feminist ambitions because it simply reinforces certain hierarchies. Number one, the onus is still put on the state, and then you prioritize the role of the international community, but specifically the UN Security Council. So unsurprisingly, we see that it's not being applied evenly. We also see that it's being applied in ways where the end isn't really the protection of civilians, but we sort of see a regime change in some cases as the end.
So could feminist foreign policy provide a framework for applying this protection norm more consistently? Could it, say, keep states from seeking regime change in other countries, or make them more likely to adhere to international humanitarian law in situations like Libya?
I don't think I'm a pessimist at heart, but I have spent enough time looking at feminist foreign policies and their practices, and I don't think anything would have been different in how they engaged. And all you have to do is look at Germany's current foreign policy approach in Gaza. For me, nothing about the German approach aligns with anything it says in its guidelines for feminist foreign policy. Absolutely nothing. Where it talks about trying to upend racism, trying to engage colonial hierarchies, which I think a rational, sane person would think that that included challenging occupation and its effects. And yet, everything Germany is doing is exactly the opposite of that. And rather, it has decided to collude to keep upholding ongoing systems of oppression. It does not make me feel very positive about a country simply having a feminist foreign policy.
There are 2 countries with feminist foreign policies that have taken a different stance on Gaza.
Spain and Slovenia have more recently said that they will recognize the Palestinian state, and they be quite vocal about the sort of atrocities being committed against Palestinians by Israel.
But neither of these countries have really mentioned that having a feminist foreign policy influenced their position.
So in the end, you could just sort of say perhaps they're both acting in line with what they see as their primary identity, their own self-image, and their positions within the international system.
It's also important to remember that feminist foreign policy is kind of the new kid on the block, and a long line of international norms and laws have already tried to solve this problem, like the UN Genocide Convention, way back in 1948.
If you look at the Genocide Convention, it does what it says on the tin. It tries to define genocidal acts, and signatories to the convention are then obligated to ensure that this doesn't happen. It's very specific. It's very much about genocide. And the implication of this is where we've then seen where atrocities have happened, and there's been a lot of debate about whether it's a genocide, whether it's acts of genocide, whether it's actually reached the threshold of genocide or not. The whole point of the Genocide Convention was this idea of never again, that after the Holocaust, we will never have another genocide because, of course, everything we did will be preventative. But that's not what happened. Not only did we not stop genocides then, and we still have them ongoing today, but we then have the sort of mass atrocities that some folks might think does not reach that threshold of genocide, but it's still people dying in really horrendous, heinous ways.
It came down to that key word, genocide. Genocides require a response. So in 1994, U.S. President Bill Clinton just refused to call what was happening in Rwanda a genocide, even though his team was using the word behind closed doors. And he wasn't the only one. States that didn't want to get involved, they would just avoid the label, which is then why we got that R2P norm, or the responsibility to protect.
It was Somalia, it was Rwanda, and in those two contexts, of course, clear genocides. But it was clearly felt that the obligation to do something was not being met simply by the existence of the convention. And I think, whereas the Genocide Convention is part and parcel of international law, R2P, for me, still feels more like a norm and dependent on practices and subject to interpretation.
A few years later, in 2000, the UN Security Council tried again when it adopted the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, which attempted in part to better protect people, and particularly women, from atrocities. But the agenda still fell short. And even when countries ostensibly support all of these existing measures that have been created throughout the years, they can still be part of the problem.
For example, if a state is charged with prevention, but is a high producer of weapons, that seems like a contradictory thing to be engaged in.
Which is where feminist foreign policies come in. Each country that has one is different, but they all build additional layers of consideration into how a country's actions impact people, both men and women, around the world.
There's, of course, a lot of potential for sort of feminist-informed interventions within the humanitarian space.
So how might that work? Can feminist foreign policies help put an end to genocide and war crimes? And what pitfalls do states motivated to dismantle the patriarchy still need to watch out for? That's after the break.
The reason for intervention itself is usually not that engaged or committed to combating existing power hierarchies or even necessarily protecting women from the worst of war in practice.
That's Toni Hastrup again.
Rather, the motivation is often to assert or reassert power. So I think, for example, of Afghanistan.
Good morning. I'm Laura Bush, and I'm delivering this week's radio address to kick off a worldwide effort to focus on the brutality against women and children by the al-Qaeda terrorist network and the regime it supports in Afghanistan.
We all know the main motivation was to sanction Afghanistan for harboring Osama bin Laden, who had engineered these attacks on the United States. However, part of the parallel narrative was very much about saving the Afghani women from the Taliban regime.
I hope Americans will join our family in working to ensure that dignity and opportunity will be secured for all the women and children of Afghanistan.
And why do I bring this up? Because actually during the time pre-intervention, we did see quite a few United States feminist organizations and women's rights organizations supporting the idea of intervention in Afghanistan on that basis.
This is one of the dangers of trying to incorporate feminist policies into an existing patriarchal system. Feminist goals like protecting human security and human rights can be used as a cover for more militaristic aims.
I would argue that women or women's rights was really a sideshow, perhaps a way to buy further support for why the US had to do what it had to do, or maybe was simply a byproduct of the US's own self-image. But what we know is that at no point in this context were Afghani women, feminist organizations engaged in any substantive way.
Meaning that the women whose lives were directly affected, as is often the case, weren't able to influence decisions made at the highest levels. A sure way to ensure that the results would never truly be good for those women or their communities.
We also know that after over 20 years, in the end, when the United States decided to pull out, this same women's rights was not a priority in designing the actual pullout and how the pullout happened. And we can now see the continued impacts of that.
We believe that the United States was never honest, and we didn't expect it to be honest in their fight against terrorism or for women's rights or freedom. They were all justifications, they were all excuses.
Salma is an activist with the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, or RAWA, which is one of the oldest feminist organizations in Afghanistan.
RAWA was established in 1977 by Mina, who herself was a young student of university. She started this organization believing that Afghan women should have their own independent organization. Even in those years, we were living in a very male-dominated society, in a very backward society that limited the rights of Afghan women. And Mina and all her friends who made up RAWA were strongly in this belief that only a political change can bring change in the life of Afghan women.
RAWA organizes demonstrations and conferences to talk about women's rights, but they also run healthcare clinics and secret schools. This was dangerous work in Afghanistan even before the Taliban came to power. RAWA's founder was assassinated in 1987. So you'll notice that we're only calling Salma by her first name.
It's a very, very difficult moment, being always under control of Taliban and facing them and their security forces. Like, for example, searching of houses. That happens very common in Afghanistan. That's Taliban military forces are entering houses of individual civilians and searching people's mobile, limiting their privacy. It's not easy to live in such circumstances.
Salma grew up during the Soviet war in Afghanistan.
My mother became a widow. We moved to Pakistan, lived as a refugee. But I was among those lucky girls who got the opportunity to be introduced to RAWA and attend RAWA school. And this is how later I became interested in being an activist myself and working with RAWA.
She's been back in Afghanistan for about 15 years, which means that she was actually abroad when the U.S. invaded in 2001.
I remember it very well because I was on a very short tour of only a week to Brussels, and I was attending meeting there when I heard, of course, we were expecting something would happen. But of course, I didn't know. And I was so busy with all the meetings those days and the program, the conference was going on. I didn't have much time to follow the news. And suddenly when I heard that the first bomb was dropped in Afghanistan and the bombing began from the main capital city where a lot of my friends and relatives were living there.
Watching it all unfold from Belgium, it was painful.
As an Afghan, we never had a normal life, an easy life. But whenever I'm far from my colleagues and my family, it feels more disturbing and more worrying. But I also remember the articles and interviews and the statements of RAWA in those days. And it was very interesting to read it now because even RAWA in those days was saying in its articles that this invasion will not eliminate fundamentalism, that this bombing will kill only Afghan people and Afghan civilians, but it will not target Taliban. And exactly these paragraphs were used 2 years ago when Taliban seized power for the second time.
Salma says that she never believed that the U.S. was in Afghanistan to protect or support women or promote peace and human rights. But she does think that those 20 years of U.S. occupation changed the landscape for women in Afghanistan, at least for a time.
Of course, I can say that there were a lot of female activists, female journalists who worked bravely in the last 20 years, and especially raising their voice against Taliban.
And most of those women are still in the country.
Very soon after the capture of Taliban, they started coming in the streets, they started writing slogans, they started having meetings, even underground meetings and organizations and publication, and using social media to bring more women around.
Defiance in Afghanistan. Women protesting in the capital Tuesday after the Taliban strips yet another freedom away.
But of course, with all the acts that Taliban, especially for making women afraid, putting them in the jails, killing them, assassinating them, threatening them, and raping them, this wave of demonstrations and protests is unfortunately now weak. And unfortunately, people of the world completely has forgotten what's happening to the Afghan women. But it's the Afghan women themselves who know that they should not go back to the middle-age policies or way of thinking of Taliban to remain prisoners in their homes.
Salma doesn't trust American intervention, but she does trust the solidarity of women around the globe.
So even if Taliban tried their best with all the threats, they would not be able to defeat people. They will not be especially able to defeat women. And what proves it is what's happening in Iran. The Iranian regime and Taliban regime is not very much different, but we see that how this was exactly 40 years of this Islamic regime. But women today are in the streets, women are accepting jails, they are executed, they are killed, they are targeted, they have been injured, but they are not giving up. So sharing the same language, the same history, the same kind of political situation, Afghan women are especially very much inspired by what's happening in Iran.
Which is similar to something that Mary told us about her work in Rwanda.
I wish women of this world could really find a way to connect. At the end of the day, we suffer the worst. Look at all these hate speeches and all women who are suffering all these violences, and the world still remains silent. Only what makes me sad is that the world has not learned anything from Rwanda's experience. And the so-called UN keeps going from resolution to resolution, and you wonder until when. It's really sad. It's sad. We are continuing to hear the hate speeches, the experience of Rwanda of hate speeches. We are now hearing them across borders. So what have we learned? Who can change this if UN itself is not putting effort to really see change? Women of this world, we need to bring in the alternative narratives.
But Mary's worked with the UN and other international organizations herself, and some of those experiences have been positive.
I think the majority I've interacted with are actually in great admiration for where we have come from and what we are doing. And I think the fact that they continue to visit Rwanda, curiously wanting to know how we have moved processes right from 1994 to where we are today, it makes us feel happy and proud that people really believe in what we do. But we are not yet there. We haven't landed. We keep seeing more complications, but as Rwandans, we've seen the worst, and we are ready to confront any other situations ahead of us.
Even with all of the attention that Mary's work has received, she still doesn't feel that the international system really hears women's voices.
I wish UN could listen to the women. There is much more self-interest. Countries are not really in it together as they claim to sound in the UN. We still see a lot of individualism, and we still see countries point fingers, judging others. I think this needs to stop.
It's a problem that Tony thinks about too.
An intervention that considers Feminist perspectives will always want to prioritize understanding how gender norms, power dynamics, and inequalities shape the experiences of different groups.
Tony says that this involves thinking beyond just armed conflict and instead considering the different types of discrimination and vulnerabilities that minoritized groups face. Representation and gender-responsive programming are also other elements that can help.
And here it's useful to maybe sort of see that programming on a continuum, because the end of violence is not always so clearly delineated. So thinking through essential services, healthcare, education, livelihood, what are the structural barriers to gender inequality, and how to ensure that just because conflict is over, we're not just reverting back to the old system.
If a country with a feminist foreign policy really wants to protect human life and prevent atrocities, then the answer, unsurprisingly, is probably prioritizing the perspectives of people who are most directly affected and avoiding military interventions that actually just benefit the interveners.
I also want to say again, at the end of the day, feminists want to disrupt and destroy the patriarchy wherever it might exist. And given that a lot of powerful people want to hold on to their power and seek different ways of reproducing that, I think I find it very difficult to say this is what a feminist intervention looks like, because in a sense that intervention itself is already problematic. But I do think that there might be avenues for feminist-informed practices in the context of interventions that have to take place. So I often say, although I'm very skeptical about the actual existence of a feminist foreign policy in a truly normative sense where that feminism will lead to liberation, I do think that there are those things that states call feminist foreign policy that might help us hold them to account. But at the same time, that only works if we are actually able to hold them to account. And what I've seen in the last year or so is that that's an uphill battle.
An uphill battle that Tony, Mary, Salma, and others will continue to fight. Next time on Things That Go Boom, what does this nostalgic commercial have to do with feminist foreign policy?
I'm Chiquita Banana, and I've come to say bananas have to ripen in a certain way. And when they're flexed...
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. If you like what we do, you can find more at inkstickmedia.com. This episode was produced by Nikki Galtland and edited by Katie Toth. The music for our show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise is our engineer. Thanks, as always, to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We will see you all again in 2 weeks.
I remember when the Resolution 1325 was passed in New York in 2000, and they came to mobilize us about it. We said we are already doing that.